Right now, 6 families you've never heard of control more money than the entire economy of Finland. They own the stores where you shop, the cement in your walls, and the bread on your table. And they all live in one country, Mexico. These families didn't just get rich, they built invisible empires that control 70% of Mexico's stock market. That's $300 billion in power. One family controls whether buildings can be built across an entire continent. Another family decides what 30 million people watch on TV every single night. A third family owns the banks, where half of Mexico keeps their money. But the truth behind how they got this power will shock you. In this video, you're going to discover how one man became the richest person on Earth by buying a single company for pocket change. You'll learn about the family meeting where a father divided billions using handwritten notes. And you'll find out why these families are now losing their grip on power. Let me show you exactly how this happened. Mexico is the 15th largest economy on planet Earth. Over 130 million people live there. It makes more cars than Germany. It's America's biggest trading partner. But here's something weird. While the United States has thousands of big companies owned by millions of people, Mexico is different. Just 10 families control almost half of everything listed on the stock exchange. This story begins in 1982. Mexico's economy crashed. Inflation went so high that prices doubled every few months. People's savings became worthless overnight. The government took over all the banks. They now owned everything important. Oil companies, phone companies, airlines, banks, even copper mines. But then something changed. In 1988, a new president named Carlos Salinas took power. He had studied economics at Harvard, and he was about to make a decision that would create some of the richest people on Earth. Salinas decided to sell everything. The phone company, the banks, the airlines, all of it. Now, here's the first surprise. When governments sell companies, they usually sell them to lots of different people to keep things fair. Mexico did the opposite. Salinas sold almost everything to a tiny group of businessmen he personally knew. These were people from elite families, people who went to the same schools, people who had connections inside the government. The sales happened fast. A phone company worth billions was sold in just weeks. And here's the kicker. Many of these businessmen didn't even have enough money to buy these companies. So the government lent them money to buy government property. Within 5 years, Mexico went from a country where the government owned everything to a country where a handful of families owned everything. These families became billionaires almost overnight. By the year 2000, they had built empires bigger than most countries' economies. Now here's where things get really interesting. His name is Carlos Slim. And for a moment in 2010, he was the richest human being who had ever lived. Richer than Bill Gates, richer than Warren Buffett, the richest person on the entire planet. Carlos Slim bought Mexico's phone company in 1990 for $1.7 billion. Experts said the company was worth at least $10 billion. He got the deal of the century. At the time, every single person in Mexico who wanted a phone had to use Slim's company Complete Monopoly. If you lived in Mexico and needed to call someone, you paid Carlos Slim, no choice. Within 10 years, that $1.7 billion purchase was worth over $50 billion. $50 billion from $1.7 billion. In just 10 years. But Slim didn't stop with phones. He used the money to buy everything. Stores, restaurants, construction companies, mining operations, even the New York Times newspaper in America. Today, the Slim family empire includes over 200 companies. If you've been to Mexico, you've given money to Carlos Slim. Sanborn's restaurant? That's Slim. Sears store in Mexico? Owned by Slim. Telcel phone? Slim. At his peak, Carlos Slim's wealth equaled 6% of Mexico's entire economy. One person owning 6% of everything in a country of 130 million people. But Carlos Slim is just one family. There are 5 more just as powerful. The Larrea family controls the biggest copper mine in Mexico. Copper's in everything: your phone, your car, your house. Germán Larrea turned his father's small mining company into the biggest mining operation in the Americas. His family is worth over $20 billion. The Cerviche family owns Grupo Bimbo, the biggest bread company in the entire world. They make Sara Lee. They make Entenmann's. They make Thomas's English muffins. They make bread in 33 countries. The family is worth over $5 billion. The Azcárraga family owns Televisa, the most powerful media company in Latin America. For decades, they controlled what 100 million Spanish speakers watched on television. In the 1990s, people joked that Mexico had three political powers: the president, the Catholic Church, and Emilio Azcárraga, who ran Televisa. Azcárraga once said, "I'm a soldier of the president and of the government." He wasn't joking. Televisa's news coverage helped decide who won elections. Politicians were terrified of them. The family controlled Mexican culture. They decided which singers became stars, which actors got famous, what stories people heard. For 50 years, Televisa was basically the voice of Mexico. The Zambrano family owns Cemex, one of the biggest cement companies on earth. You cannot build anything without cement. Houses, roads, bridges, nothing. The Zambrano family sells cement in over 50 countries. Their company is worth $30 billion. 6 families, different industries, all unimaginably wealthy. All built their empires from the same moment when the government sold everything. But if you think that's crazy, wait until you hear this. The year is 1996. Ricardo Salinas Pliego calls his 4 sons into a room. He takes out pieces of paper. On these papers, he's divided his entire business empire between his sons. Handwritten notes, billions of dollars split up like a family recipe. But Ricardo isn't dying. He's in his 40s. He's at the peak of his power. So why is he giving everything away? Because Ricardo understands something the other families are just learning. The monopoly era is ending. And if you don't adapt, you lose everything. For years, these families operated without competition. Carlos Slim controlled phones, the Azcárragas controlled TV. They could charge whatever they wanted. But then Mexico signed NAFTA in 1994. This was a trade agreement with the United States and Canada. Suddenly, American companies could compete in Mexico. Walmart came to Mexico. American phone companies wanted in. Satellite TV companies challenged Televisa. The families fought back hard. Carlos Slim spent millions on lawyers to block competitors. Televisa used political connections to stop satellite TV. But something else was happening that was even more dangerous: the internet. Televisa controlled what Mexicans watched because there were only a few TV channels. But with the internet, anyone could watch anything. YouTube, Netflix. Streaming changed everything. Carlos Slim controlled phones because you needed physical phone lines. But smartphones and internet calling meant you could talk without using his network. The monopolies were breaking. Ricardo Salinas split his empire so each son could adapt faster. One son got the retail stores. Another got the bank. Another got the TV network. Another got the cell phone business. Other families watched and learned. The Slim family began investing in technology. They bought stakes in internet companies. The Azcárraga family launched online streaming. Cemex started using artificial intelligence. But then came 2012. Mexico elected a new president named Enrique Peña Nieto. He promised to break up the monopolies, and he actually did it. In 2013 and 2014, Mexico passed massive reform laws. Carlos Slim had to let competitors use his phone network. Televisa had to share airwaves with new TV channels. Carlos Slim's wealth dropped by $25 billion in just 3 years. Because competition finally came to Mexico's phone industry, Televisa's viewership started falling. In 2000, they had 70% of all TV viewers. By 2018, less than 40%. Young people weren't watching TV anymore. Cemex almost went bankrupt during the 2008 financial crisis. They had borrowed billions to expand. When the crisis hit, They had to sell assets. These families went from untouchable to vulnerable in just 1 decade. But despite these challenges, they're still incredibly powerful. Carlos Slim is still one of the 15 richest people on Earth. They survived by adapting. This brings us to the most shocking discovery of all. While these old families were adapting, a completely new generation of Mexican billionaires was rising up. And they didn't get rich from government privatization. A new group has emerged. Some from tech entrepreneurship, others from darker sources that nobody talks about openly. Here's the uncomfortable truth. When you have massive inequality, when 6 families control 70% of wealth, when regular people can't get ahead legally, some people find other ways. Mexican drug cartels make somewhere between $19 and $29 billion a year. That money doesn't disappear. It flows into legitimate businesses, real estate, car dealerships, restaurants, construction companies. That money competes with the traditional families. Cartel money can offer construction contracts that undercut Cemex. They can finance competitors to established businesses. But the old families can't complain. Because if they do, they become targets. One former Mexican official said that in some parts of Mexico, cartel-connected businesses have more economic power than traditional family businesses. But that's only half the story of new Mexican wealth. Young Mexican entrepreneurs are building legitimate tech companies, and some became billionaires faster than even Carlos Slim. There's a wave of Mexican tech entrepreneurs who've sold companies to American giants for billions. These are people building wealth without government favors or inherited monopolies. And these new entrepreneurs hate the old family monopolies. They see them as dinosaurs. They see them as what's wrong with Mexico. They want competition. They want fair markets. This creates a 3-way power struggle. The old families protecting their empires, the shadow economy creating competition, and young entrepreneurs building a new Mexico. But there's one more layer that changes everything. The current Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, everyone calls him AMLO, has a completely different view of how Mexico should work. AMLO is a leftist. He doesn't like big business. He doesn't trust billionaires. He thinks privatization was a disaster for regular Mexicans. Look at the results of 30 years of family monopolies. Mexico has some of the richest people on Earth. But 43% of Mexicans live in poverty, almost half the country. The monopolies kept prices high. Carlos Slim's phone service cost more than in the United States. Even though Mexicans earn way less, the benefits went to 6 families, not to 130 million Mexicans. AMLO is trying to reverse some privatization. He's investing billions in state-owned companies. He's building a government internet network to compete with Carlos Slim. The old families are terrified of AMLO, but he's incredibly popular with regular Mexicans. His approval rating has been above 60% because regular people are tired of seeing billionaires get richer while they struggle. This is the $300 billion power war, old families fighting to keep empires, new entrepreneurs building a modern economy, shadow money creating competition, and a government trying to take back control. So, what does all this mean for us today? Here's why this matters, even if you don't live in Mexico. First, Mexico is America's biggest trading partner, bigger than China. Over $600 billion in trade every year. When you buy a car, there's a 35% chance it was built in Mexico. If these family monopolies control Mexico's economy, they control prices. When Cemex raises cement prices, construction costs go up in America. Houses cost more. Roads cost more. Second, immigration. Want to know one reason people leave Mexico? Because 6 families control 70% of wealth, and regular people can't get ahead. Imagine trying to start a business in Mexico. You're competing against Carlos Slim, against Cemex, against Bimbo. These companies have unlimited money and government connections. You have a dream and a small loan. Who wins? The monopolies crush competition, so people give up and leave. The migration issue in American politics is directly connected to these family monopolies. Third, what happens in Mexico is happening everywhere. Family monopolies controlling economies isn't unique. It's happening in Brazil, India, South Korea. Around the world, wealth is concentrating into fewer hands. Mexico is just the most extreme example. This story reveals something about capitalism itself. Is capitalism about competition? Or is it about using money and power to eliminate competition? Mexico shows what happens when competition gets eliminated. The families who got monopolies in 1990 still have them in 2025. Not because they're better, but because they used money and connections to prevent competition. This is happening in America too. Big tech companies buy potential competitors. Giant corporations lobby for regulations that hurt small businesses. Mexico just shows what happens when this goes further. There's a climate angle. The Larrea mining family extracts copper and metals essential for electric cars and solar panels. The green energy transition depends on these Mexican families. If they restrict supply to raise prices, the entire global green transition gets more expensive. A handful of families have tremendous power over humanity's energy future. But here's the final twist happening right now in 2025. China. Chinese companies are flooding into Mexico. They're building factories. They're buying businesses. They're investing billions. America has been putting tariffs on Chinese products. But there's a loophole. If Chinese companies build factories in Mexico, they can export to America under NAFTA rules. Mexico is becoming China's back door into the American market. Chinese companies have more money than even the Mexican billionaire families. The Chinese government backs them with unlimited financing. This is creating a fourth player in Mexico's power war. Old Mexican families, new tech entrepreneurs, shadow cartel economy, and now Chinese companies with infinite resources. Carlos Slim is partnering with Chinese telecom companies. Cemex is competing against Chinese cement companies. The Cerveche family is trying to stop Chinese bakeries from entering Mexico. But Chinese companies aren't playing by old rules. They're not trying to buy monopolies. They'll take lower profits to gain market share. They use technology better. They move faster. This might accidentally break the monopolies, not through government regulation, but through a flood of Chinese money that's too big to control. There's one more final twist. The next generation of these families is different from their parents. The children and grandchildren grew up wealthy. They went to Harvard, MIT, Stanford. Many are embarrassed by the monopolies their families built. They see the inequality. Some genuinely want to change things. There's a quiet generational fight inside these families. The old generation wants to protect monopolies at all costs. The young generation wants to modernize and compete fairly. Who wins this internal battle will determine Mexico's future as much as any government policy. So, let's bring this full circle. 6 families, $300 billion, control over the 15th largest economy on Earth. These families got their power through a specific moment in history, when the Mexican government sold everything to a small group of insiders. That decision in the late 1980s created the most concentrated wealth in the Western Hemisphere. For 30 years, they operated with minimal competition. They charged high prices. They blocked competitors. They became some of the richest people who have ever lived. But now everything is changing. Technology is breaking their monopolies. Competition is arriving. A new generation with different values is taking over. Chinese companies are flooding in, and the government is trying to take back control. The $300 billion question is simple. Who will control Mexico's future? Here's what we know. Mexico is too big to stay in the shadows. It's America's biggest trading partner. What happens there affects the entire world. The battle for Mexico's future is really about what kind of capitalism we want. Do we want economies dominated by a few ultra-wealthy families? Or competitive markets where anyone can succeed? Six families built empires from one moment of opportunity. They became wealthier than kings. They shaped hundreds of millions of lives. But empires don't last forever. Concentrated power eventually breaks apart. The only question is how, when, and what comes next. The families who secretly own Mexico's future are fighting to keep that ownership. But the future belongs to whoever adapts fastest to change. And in 2025, change is coming faster than ever before. That's the $300 billion power war. That's the secret story of Mexico's billionaire families. And that's why you should care about six families you'd never heard of until today. Because their story is really about power, inequality, and the future of capitalism itself. And that affects all of us, no matter where we live. If this story opened your eyes to how power really works behind the scenes, make sure you're subscribed because I've got more shocking investigations coming that will change how you see the world.